I begin with a quote from one of the most important documents of Vatican II, Dei Verbum, right? It's on Revelation. How does the church understand Revelation tradition? The tradition, the bishops write, which comes from the apostles, develops in the church with the help of the Holy Spirit, for there is a growth in understanding of the realities and the words that have been handed down. This happens through the contemplation and the study made by believers who treasure these things in their hearts. For as the centuries succeed one another, the church constantly moves forward toward the fullness of divine truth until the words of God reach their complete fulfillment. So the church constantly moves forward. Great, nice. Thank you, bishops. But how? This is what I would like to speak with you all about this morning for a little while, what it means for the church to be now in our times a public religion in a secular age, how we are to do so, what is our role. The fundamental argument I'm going to offer you is this: the particular capacities, the unique gifts that various religious, or in fact non-religious traditions, but today we'll talk about you all in the Catholic Church and the Focolare movement. The unique gifts that various religions are able to offer in public emerge precisely from the unique kind of formation that they induce in private. The kind of person you become in private conditions the kind of gifts you can give in public. These are related, of course, the public and the private, in all kinds of complex ways, most of which I'm not going to talk about this morning. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about lots of other complex things. A good Jesuit friend of mine said that, God forbid, if I'm ever named a bishop and have to give an Episcopal motto for myself, it would be putting theory on your experience. So, he's right. But for us gathered here, it's not just we, but God who responds to the needs of our times. The signs of our times are not just our response, but His. And so I want to begin by talking about two responses. One that came at the birth of the modern age, and one that comes at the birth of a secular age. The first, you will not be surprised to learn, is the Society of Jesus. And the second, the movements. So we have two foundings here, and I begin by sketching these two contexts within which they were founded. The first founding, the Society of Jesus and the crisis of modernity in the church, a crisis that is still undergoing. In fact, just to say, right, so my academic colleagues will not blast me, secularity is a consequence of modernity. Okay, we move on. All right. The crisis of modernity means, in many ways, the crisis of individuality, the crisis of the individual. The tensions of modernity, I think, can be understood through remembering that 4 major revolutions happened that birthed the modern world. The first, political revolutions. We forget about it, but the American Revolution was a revolution of modernity, and so was the French and many others. This was the splitting apart of religious and secular governance, state from church, and that also split the public from the private. It also split science from religion, blah, 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 the splitting. Scientific and industrial revolution is the second. Here we could see this drastically increased capacity to understand and control and transform the natural world in the scientific revolution. The third, which is related, is what Kant termed the Copernican revolution, this turn to the subject, the individual decision maker, the bearer of a conscience. And the fourth, we could see, maybe I have forgotten to write that down. Well, anyway, there are others as well that carved out for us a differentiation between the modern world and the medieval world, down which the Holy Spirit could walk to give the gifts that God may have wanted to give to the church, through the church to the world. We know this now, but we may not have always known it, right? We know how to do that now, but we did not always know it. So a second founding, the movements. What does secularity mean, and how can we understand the movements as a response to this? I think the crisis of secularity is not a crisis of individuality. That was the first one. The crisis of secularity is a consequence of this. It's a crisis of unity. The tensions of the secular are the tensions of life in a hyper-pluralized world, an incapacity we feel to hold ourselves together as communities, as persons, as nations. This happens on all kinds of levels. It happens largest on the cosmic level. We see this polarization there in that we no longer agree on the meaning of anything. It's not just that the chain of being, right, that Plato would have talked about has been fractured, but that we can't decide whether there was creation or evolution, whether the Big Bang was there or Adam and Eve were created. These explanations for the world are rivalrous now. The same kinds of things happen on our national level, where in America we see this massive decline of what the great sociologist Robert Bellah called the American civil religion that glued Catholics and Protestants and Jews together throughout most of the 20th century in the United States. That fracturing arose from the question of how are we going to incorporate more newcomers? How are Hindus and Muslims and others going to be incorporated into this civil religion in the United States of America? But the consequences of that in terms of the polarization we face right now are drastic. And then some of the right-wing responses we've seen, the rise of white Christian nationalism, for example, are responses to this effort to include. Third level, we see institutional polarization. It's not just, in fact, that in the United States, but really all over Western Europe, we have a drastic decline in trust of all kinds of institutions. Particularly, we see a drastic decline in religious institutions. This goes for the Catholic Church, but we're not unique in any way here. What we see in this is that our bishops, right, cannot agree with one another. There's constant fighting amongst themselves. There are often refusals to agree with the Pope, whether this Pope was John Paul II or now Pope Francis. This polarization ad intra to our religious institutions. And what this causes, sociologically speaking, is personal, individual pluralization and polarization. All of those rivalries that happen out there on these macro levels get in here, inside of us. Because we live in a world that's exposed, where we are exposed to so many competing roles, scripts, cultures, nations, institutions, imaginaries, because we have to master the languages that go along with all of them, we have to know how to talk about creationism and Adam and Eve, and how to talk about the Big Bang and evolution. If we don't know how to do these things in different spaces, we just make a fool of ourselves. And having to master all of these different languages mean that all those things get in us, and they start arguing with each other. This happens often in my experience with students in the classroom. I teach at Loyola University in Chicago. They are so good. Gen Z, I just experienced them as so good. They want so much to be good, and they're very afraid of not being good. I'm sympathetic. I'm very sympathetic. I have no judgment there. A fear comes, I think, from this deep desire to not want to hurt anyone else who is different from them. And what that produces is this sense like, I will not say anything, better to not do that than to risk saying something and hurting them or having them castigate me for doing so, even if I had made a mistake. They withdraw from each other, therefore, and start tiptoeing around each other in word or in deed. Like often when they want to say something in my sociology classes that's a little tender, they start with like 6 caveats. Well, blah, I don't know, but this, and then I totally understand. All right. And they walk around the campus with their headphones on rather than mutually engaging. I try very hard to get them to not wear headphones on campus. So the summary of all of this secularity, the great sociologist Jose Casanova, also from the New School and from Georgetown University, a friend of Amy's, he once put it this way in his most famous book. He said, if the temple of ancient polytheism was the pantheon, the place where all of the known and the unknown gods could be worshipped simultaneously, the temple of our modern polytheism is the mind of the individual self. What does this have to do with us? The movements, as you all know very well, were born in a really narrow window of time. I mean, the church, was trying to do something like this. By the church, I mean the people of God. We're trying to give birth to things like this over a long period of time. But really, what we know is the movements were born basically between 1940 and 1970. Maybe they will continue, maybe not. Maybe there'll be new ones, maybe not. But it's really 30 years. And in that time, we see not only the three great Italian movements, of which you all are a part, but the Neo-Catechumenal Way, Opus Dei, just before happening there, the Catholic Worker, again, just before all of this, but L'Arche, right in that window, Chemin Neuf, right in that window, Hans Urs von Balthasar's Johannine Community, right in that window of time. All of these, I think, are answers, efforts to answer this tension that we feel, this aspiration to unity and to wholeness in our secular life that produces this kind of internal pluralization within us. It's an effort to deal with our secularized context. There are two strengths that I think come along with this. The first is political, right? The movements provided an answer that the church needed. How are we going to be a public church? How are we going to influence the world when we no longer control the state, right? We do not, in fact, make alliances with the state anymore. In fact, amongst the major branches of Christianity, the Catholic Church is now the only institution that is not affiliated formally with any state. Every other major institution is affiliated with the state. That's a huge shift from 100 years ago. But this was a solution to this political problem. It was also a solution to, you also, were a solution to an ecclesial problem. It provided a response to this idea of secularity. As one theologian says, the movements suggest that the secular is not antithetical to the experience of God, but instead, the very locus in which the experience of God might become possible. You're aimed in this way is at integrating in the world the sacred and the secular. Ratzinger put it this way, Benedict XVI. The point is not to live Christianity apart from the secular world, but to live as integrated Christians within it. Von Balthasar put it this way. The movements should serve as, quote, a fundamental integrative role for persons in our secular world. Excellent. But there are two weaknesses that come along with this as well. One is political. Sometimes, in fact, despite our best efforts, there have been efforts to, recapture the state, to become deeply politically influential and powerful all over again. Opus Dei fell most deeply involved with this and their alliances with the Spanish government, especially during fascism there, very difficult. But this happens in many different places and different times. But it also happens ecclesially, I think a little more deeply, that the movements can tend to become sectarian or self-referential. It can fall into the tendency of seeing themselves as bulwarks against this encroaching, dangerous thing. Oh no, the secular world out there. John Paul II, in fact, peace be upon him, prompted some of this. He, in fact, understood the movements as bulwarks against the de-Christianization of Europe. And often, yourselves and others, years ago, responded to precisely that call. He asked, you answered. But it's a temptation. Not because this was wrong to do what the Pope asked, right? But because it did not show any attention to the particularity of each movement's charism. It instrumentalized the movements. Benedict XVI and Francis both see this, and they've tried to move away from this way. Benedict said that the movements offer inhabitants, participants, of a society of uncertainty, a familiar place, a home. Francis is very similar. What he keeps saying is purify your charisms and allow them to become gifts for the world. Sociologically speaking, then, the movements, I think, can be read as organizations that took up the challenge of secularity, constructing shared forms of life that responded to these needs within the church and politically. The result of this is that each movement, I think, possesses two gifts, one private and one public. Or better, maybe, it's the same gift deployed in two different spaces, in a private space and in a public space. It's that gift, yours, that I really want to talk about today. The primary gift, the kind of Christian that a Focolare member is. You are a gift in imitating Christ in this way. Second, how a Christian like that loves the world and loves in the world. You are a gift in how you are a public religion in our secular age. In other words, my argument this morning is this. It is only by returning, by embracing and purifying in an ongoing fashion, as we heard in Dignitatis Humanae that I read to you, in Dei Verbum, that I read to you. Returning to the characteristic gift you have been given, that you can respond to the challenge of our secular age in a full way. And withdrawing from your gift means withdrawing from the opportunity to help the church respond to the needs of the world. You were born at a moment of fragmentation of the cosmic, national, institutional, personal levels of society. So perhaps you have a capacity here to respond to these challenges in a way that God is seeking to offer not just to you, but to others. I want to show you what this looks like then, in my own context as a Jesuit, in the birth of the modernity, and then to turn to a more fine-grained analysis of what I understand, really one aspect of what I understand about you yourselves. The society first, right, in modernity. The society was founded in 1540, right, in the middle of the 16th century by St. Ignatius and 9 of his friends. They had studied at the University of Paris together, earning graduate degrees. They were masters of theology, and becoming friends in this way of prayer, they ended up traveling to Venice in hopes of going to the Holy Land, where really they were probably going to be martyred, right? Like this is what they were, kind of imagining. Luckily, there were no ships leaving for the Holy Land. And after years of doing ministry there in Venice together, they would just go preach on street corners and serve the poor and, and educate and teach and all this kind of stuff as friends. And they lived together. They decided to go to Rome, present themselves to the Pope, offer themselves to go wherever he thought they were most in need. Xavier, as you all know, St. Francis Xavier went to India, right, the great missionary. Many others went to many other places. Ignatius, despite his own wishes to go elsewhere, remained in Rome and wrote the constitutions of the society. He died in 1556. Between 1540, when there were 10 of them, and 1556, when he died, the Society of Jesus grew from 10 to 1,000 and rooted itself in nearly every country in Western Europe. It founded schools, which the church had never done before, all over the continent, and sent missionaries to Brazil, Japan, Ethiopia, etc. How? Because it radically changed what religious life meant. We did it. Similar ministries. We did very similar ministries to what the Franciscans or the Dominicans, our great brothers did and sisters did. But the 350 years separating the founding of these things totally changes the context of these ministries. These are not the same. What did we do? Well, as you all know, we individualized them. This is what Jesuits do, right? We do not have a distinctive habit. I wear this because this is the garb of priests in the United States. We retain our family names. I'm not known as, Father Ignatius or something, but by my name. We elect our generals for life. The very name of the order struck everybody else as arrogant. Why didn't we get called the Iniguistas, right? Like Ignatians? Because, we're a little self-referential. But even more particularly, we do not chant the hours in choir together. Instead, we're out in the world. What that meant was that we did not disdain the things of the world, education, healthcare, schools, all of this, but instead sought to use them for the good of God. Modernity, secularity are tied. This came from one strange source within us, the spiritual exercises. Many of you will know this, but these are really just patterned notes about what Ignatius will experience unfolding inside of him. They came from all kinds of traditional influences, but they're really a record of his individualistic spiritual experience. They tried to create a way, a pattern, a space for God to deal directly with the creature. This is in fact explicitly in the exercises, annotation 15. And this is incredibly dangerous. Because what it means is, if God deals directly with the individual, why do you need a church? Right? It's Protestantism inside the church. Or is it? Right? This is the debate that always happens around us. Over and over and over again. This structure, right, created an individual, though. Making the exercises was supposed to make you a certain kind of person, a person that didn't need to dress in a certain way or have their name changed or pray the hours in common, because the discipline of being a Christian was where? In you, inside. The strategy for us being modern persons was to interiorize our spirituality, interiorizing particularly the famous rules for discernment. How can we tell where it's God acting in the world and where it's our own voices and where it's another voice of the enemy, perhaps? We invented, in this way, the modern Catholic self, but this produced huge tensions. Ignatius, as you all know, was arrested by the Dominicans many times, right? Before he was formally approved and the exercises were stamped. Even after the exercises were published with the approval of the Pope, he had to defend them in public many times before he died, over these first 15 years. The result in the society after Ignatius' death was that we were a little afraid of this kind of radical individualization. And there are problems with it, I want to say, there are. We can go too far. And the society in response pulled back from this kind of individuation. We standardized all kinds of things over the tenures of our first generals, maybe 7 or 8 of them. We had this official directory, the instruction manual for how you're supposed to give the exercises. We stopped giving them individually, as Ignatius and the first founders had done, but instead gave them in big retreats like this, where you had to listen to a preacher, right? All of these things standardized and de-individualized the gift. We backed away from it. And we didn't betray it. We did all kinds of cool things until our suppression. And then in the Restoration, we backed away even further after society. We were so afraid. The Pope's soldiers, the Pope's Marines, and the long black line, this really comes from the time of the refounding of the society. And we had forgotten our individualization and standardized ourselves. We were the ultramontanists extraordinaire. Is there a gift? Sure there is, yes. But it took a long time for that to be honed. 500 years is maybe enough, right? To know that we can trust the rules for discernment, to know what we're actually aimed at, and we still make mistakes in it all the time. I get frustrated. But it's easy to say after 5 centuries. It's more difficult after 75 years. So yourselves. Is there a gift here in the charism that you've been given? What is it? Right? How does it relate, this public and private senses of religion? My effort to answer this question, as Amy said to you all earlier, really involved probably 4 years now in continuing of a pretty, hopefully, intense immersion into your lives. And I went and stayed at Luminosa a number of times and said Mass for you all and talked to people and came to this conference in 2020 and blah, blah, blah. The things a sociologist is supposed to do. What did I learn? Well, many things, most of which I cannot share with you because we don't have enough time. But we'll start with the basics, and then I'll walk into one absolutely important thing about what I understand as your central practice. The basics, as you all know, right? What is a movement about? What's its telos? What's its purpose, its end? Unity. As Chiara said, right? Unity is the word that sums up the life of our movement. How much of the fact that the unity of a movement born in the midst of secularization and plurality is to be attributed to coincidence, and how much to providence, I leave to others. But it's right there. How, though, is unity accomplished? You all already know the answer to this, but it took me time to learn. The means to unity is Jesus forsaken, right? Embracing Jesus forsaken. This means then that in my efforts to understand, I took Jesus forsaken to be a method, like a strategy, a practice for accomplishing unity. And I tried to do it. I tried to learn from you guys how you did it. I listened and watched and observed, like we're sitting at dinner and I'm happy to be with you all, but I'm also like, what is going on here, right? And asking all kinds of questions, and as you know, I interviewed many of you in this room and talked to you about your experiences of it to get you to teach me what you had been taught. How do you live this way? How did it happen? Tell me the stories. Show me. So I began, maybe an important thing there, this kind of sociology that I do is distinct in this way. It does not presume that people are naturally secular or naturally religious, I would say, neither. But instead, that these capacities get cultivated in us, and I wanted you to show me how. How did I do it? How did you do it? So the method for that, I want to say a few things about briefly, because it will open up my understanding of what's going on in the practice of embracing Jesus forsaken. I analyzed this practice through what my friend, the really, really good philosopher at Calvin College in Michigan, James K.A. Smith, calls thick practices. Thick practices. For thick practices, basically, they're differentiated from thin. Thick practices are like the spool around which the thread of our thin practices get wound. Right? It's the thing that winds up, that binds together all of these other things we do. Yeah, I go to lunch and I have a job and I talk about this, but the thing that gathers them, that's the thick practice. There are all kinds then of thick practices, some that are secular and some that are religious and some that are half both, right? But the thick practice and how it gathers the thin ones, that's what's being studied in all of my efforts to understand Sant'Egidio as well, and Communio Liberazione and yourselves, these kinds of things. I would also love to have done the same thing with all kinds of other movements, some that are secular and etc. But these liturgies, you can see, these like liturgical practices, these thick practices, they're everywhere in the world, all around us there. And they're often represented by like slogans that we know, right? That's what the bumper stickers that read, Semper Fi mean. They're significations of a thick practice. I became a Marine, right? Everything makes sense in light of that. But it's also what Make America Great Again means, right? This. So we take our understanding in these all kinds of different ways. And there are many religious ones of different kinds. This is just one. Again, these are integrating practices because, as Jose Casanova says, the temple of modern polytheism is the mind of the individual self. It needs to be rebound. What a thick practice does then is rebundle what has been unbundled. It gathers, in a biblical idiom, what has been scattered. The thick practice of the Society of Jesus is the spiritual exercises. Yours, embracing Jesus forsaken. How do you learn it? Well, as one of you told me over a beautiful dinner at a place that shall go unnamed, our way is only learned by loving. So just as for the society, it's practicing the practice of the spiritual exercises, making the retreat over and over again, praying in these ways, that we become Ignatian persons who build Ignatian institutions like Loyola Chicago or Georgetown University, hopefully, right? They are repeated efforts, your repeated efforts, to embrace Jesus forsaken well, to practice the practice properly, right? As Chiara did it, or as others did it, as those you look up to do it in this room. It's by doing this that you become the kinds of persons who, for example, excel at dialogue, or in listening, or in self-emptying, or in companionship. So I ask 4 questions doing this kind of analysis. 1, what does the practice want? What is it seeking? For you all, unity. 2, how do you do it? How do the experts perform it? So I listen to them and try to learn. So in my time with you, I asked many of you questions like this, right? How do you do it? And I asked it because I wanted to know not just that, which is important, and not because I was trying to be duplicitous, I really wasn't, but because I really wanted to know, who does it make you? That's the 3rd question. What kind of person does performing this thick practice make you? Who do you become? Not just how, and not just why, but what happens to you when you do it? It's that leads to the final intervention. What kind of public interventions do you become capable of after you're this kind of person? What kind of thing can only this kind of person do in a unique fashion? The particular capacities and the unique gifts that various religious traditions are able to offer in public emerge from the kind of formation that they induce. What did I learn? Well, I learned about the practice of Jesus forsaken. Once I was talking with a woman. She told me a story of a lunch she had with 2 Orthodox rabbis. She's a Focolarina, I will not give her name. She had a lunch with 2 Orthodox rabbis and their wives. One of them, because of his religious practice, couldn't look at her, right? Instead, he looked to the side of her the entire time. So he would speak to her at lunch, but wouldn't look at her. And as she described this, she had described a moment of feeling that even though this person was literally not looking at her, there was an experience for her of unity in that moment, where she had made herself open and available to this person. I can be with you even though you are literally not looking me in the face. And I said, I was amazed, and I asked her this question that I think, for me, it was a natural question, right? And I said, well, right, but I understand that this was your experience, that it was a moment of unity, but isn't it also literally a moment of being overlooked? And she laughed exactly like you did here. And she said, yeah, that actually is true, if it ever would have occurred to me to think of it that way. It's like, that's the practice. So I asked her to explain it. She said, this is the practice. Empty yourself. Listen. Be in an attitude of gift of yourself to the other. That will generate openness that the other will feel. It's the openness that generates unity. So once I had that, I went back to a famous talk that, well, maybe it's famous to me, maybe, I don't know if it's famous to you guys actually, that Chiara gave in 1972 to the responsibles of the movement in Rocca di Papa. And she said there, she was instructing them again on how to do the practice of Jesus Forsaken. It's the clearest example that I have ever found. She begins there with the story of the famous, not so mentally stable Austrian Laszlo Toth smashing the statue of Michelangelo, and how hurtful that was for her. And then she walks through her steps of practicing Jesus Forsaken, laying them out for the men and women who were there. How do you do this, in other words, is what she's saying. What I learned from that, and I do this in longer form in the manuscript I'm working on, the book work, is there are maybe 5 steps, I think, to the practice. I'm just going to focus on one of them, the second step, and it's that moment of opening, of opening yourself. I learned that when presented with a moment of disunity, as this woman did in her conversation with the rabbis, at the very moment when suffering impinges, when you're overlooked maybe, or shocked by, stunned, as Chiara said, by the smashing of the statue, instead of closing oneself off, a Focolare person opens themselves up at exactly that point, which is a radically different response to suffering than we would see in the normal world, quote-unquote normal world. Instead of moving away then, Focolare members move closer. Embracing Jesus Forsaken involves noticing suffering in oneself or in another, and instead of moving away, embracing. This moving closer involves learning how to set aside your own feelings in order to welcome the feelings of another. This is what my informant was saying when she described this as emptying, as adopting this attitude of gift of oneself to another. So the practice of Jesus Forsaken involves opening, remaining, giving oneself at the very point of suffering. It means transforming a moment of pain from a blockage into a relationship. It's very powerful. Which is why I think you describe yourselves, right, the Focolarina and Focolarine, as drawn to disunity like filaments to a magnet. Every split, every division is like a magnet. Because it's there that unity is lacking. It's for this that the Focolare have given their lives. Maybe this doesn't seem strange to you guys, but listen, it is. This new relationship with suffering is incredibly powerful. It's not a relation of suffering that puts distance between, right, but that embraces. As the Spanish theologian Jesus Castellano Cervera put it in his introduction to Chiara's wonderful book, Unity in Jesus Forsaken, he says, sufferings no longer cause alarm, but become a motive and an invitation to love more intensely. Crazy. You guys are crazy. This is the first answer to the gift, right? The answer in private. You become the kind of person who has a reformulated relationship with suffering by embracing rather than withdrawing. Remaining on just this step, it makes you a certain kind of person. I'll describe it briefly because I only have 10 minutes left here. But what it is that you all incorporate what the great philosopher Charles Taylor, the French-Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, would call a porous rather than a buffered self. What that means is that you live in the world such that you're willing to be open to the world, allowing things in rather than buffering yourselves off. from moments of pain, which is very difficult, right? Very difficult to do. The buffered self is the normal way of living in the world. It's this natural Western way of living. We all know it. We all know it. Even all of you here, you know what it is, right? It's that instead of, if you're at lunch with the rabbis, instead of saying, well, obviously this was a moment of unity, it's like, this person's a jerk, all right? And I will no longer engage with them. I want to let them hurt me. To be a buffered self is not a bad thing. It's a strategy for dealing with pain. And it works, but it comes with consequences. So does porosity. The porous self is not capable, it does not choose to master suffering by disengaging. Instead, it does not become invulnerable, but opens. This choice then to engage, immerse, depend, means becoming vulnerable. Much more vulnerable than a buffered self will be able to be. You are affected by the sufferings of the world in a way that is difficult. For a buffered self, then, the protective or the healing tactic is the deployment of the buffer. Such a self says, quite rationally, I won't think about that stuff anymore. I'm not going to do that any longer. That person has nothing to do with me. That's not my president. But for a porous self, it is very different. Engagement instead. This metamorphosis happens, I think, in the practice of embracing Jesus forsaken. It's not that you're permanently porous, it's that you know how to do it, right? You seek it out. It's fantastic, I think. This is the real answer, right, to what Chiara meant when she said, I am not myself when I close myself off from the other, but rather when I give myself. When out of love I lose myself in the other. My subjectivity is when, out of love, it is completely transferred into the other. The characteristic gift of the movement in private. You're able to become porous and reformulate a relationship with suffering. And because of doing that, you can empower dialogue in places that others would just have withdrawn from. There will be no conversation because I am not here. But now there is. Or at least there's the possibility. The second gift, Focolare as public religion. What are you capable of because of it? I could talk a long time about, I make an argument, in fact, in different places that this capacity empowers the public sphere. The possibility of dialogue and of debate, even of argumentation, not to disagree with what Amy said earlier, but argument only happens, actually, I think, in this kind of space. Many arguments I could make about this kind of thing. Instead, I want to talk about something else, though. The economy of communion. Because this does not just happen in, the political public sphere, where we talk about what's good for us and the common good. It also happens in the sphere of the market, in economics. How do you live like this as a porous self within this, world of instrumental rationality, where, products and money are more important than people? It's not easy, right? As many of you know more than me. I interviewed one man who runs a pretty significant company who talked about some of his difficulties with this. It's an EOC business, but only partially, right? It's not a profit-sharing business, but the culture of the business is deeply infected or influenced by the economy of communion, very powerful. What he noted instead was that, and I think that's much more important for me, the culture formation is much more important than the monetary effects of this. So what kind of culture is it? He talked about it this way. First he said, there is an intense pressure on me all the time to act otherwise than as the Focolare instruct me to do. There's so much pressure, he says, to balance the books. We're not a full EOC company, we're venture-backed. And while the majority of the profits go back to my investors, our culture code, he says, starts with this: put the other one first. Wow. We say all the time inside the business, we only win when the customer wins. Even then, though, it's very difficult to hold this culture inside of a space like business there, especially when difficulties like the pandemic or the recessions hit. He noted at this time, he went to the board, he's the CEO, went to the board and said, I don't know what to do here. What do you want me to do? They, of course, want him to do what everybody wants, what every board wants, fire people, slash and burn your way back to a balanced accounting. And he's like, I can't do that. I can't do that. So through leaning on the practices of the movement, prayer, going to mass, whatnot, also talking to his friends, reminding him of how he wanted to live. He was like, no, we're going to do something radically different. We're going to try to think of another way. Think about it this way. If the practice of the buffered self is to erect the buffer and to leave the space, that just equates to firing. Get them out of here as opposed to my withdrawal. But instead, remaining means trying to find another way, right? Then separation to solve the problem. And he was able to in this moment. Now we all know we're not always able to. We don't live in a magical world. Sometimes failures happen. But this was not one of those. He was able to succeed here. But what those conversations did to him, I quote him, he said, "They gave me the peace to challenge my investors and to remind them of the game that we want to play. This is the game based not on withdrawal from the commitments he's made to others, to his employees or his shareholders, but to remaining within them. This is the game of the Focolare movement played on the field of economics. It's a refusal to allow market rationality to dictate behavior, the strenuous effort of making a new kind of economic action possible." So, for the Focolare, for you all, if business ever becomes just business, it's just business, man. It's a complete failure, right? Now, I want to recap here. I'm going to go a little over, Amy. I need to do this. So we have a few moments here. I want to talk about one and a half last things. It's about the characteristic fragility, that I call it, that comes embedded within this kind of self and this kind of practice, because it's amazing and powerful, but it also has fragilities, is the right word to it. So what have we said? Jesus Forsaken empowers another kind of relationship to suffering. It transforms it. And this not only interiorly, creating you as kinds of persons, but exteriorly, in the world, a new kind of politics, a new kind of economics. And it does this, as I've argued, by helping you become porous, making yourselves vulnerable, which means woundable, to another kind of person or action or moment. The consequence of this is that vulnerability is baked into your charism, right? You can't get it out while still seeking the unity that you seek in the way that you pursue it. It doesn't go away. It's constitutive vulnerability, which makes it dangerous. So it's not to say that a characteristic fragility is unique only to you. In fact, it's shared across all of these different kinds of thick practices. What's the characteristic fragility of the Society of Jesus? Individualism, right? We transform our communities into hotels where people just come back to sleep so they can go work some more, right? Terrible, but it's real. Which does not mean that we don't have a gift. 500 years testify to the fact that we do. But it's very difficult. So for yourselves, this characteristic fragility comes in a number of different ways, but I think primarily it comes in the elision of unity and uniformity. As you all know, right, this tension that's there. But why is it there? It's there because in seeking unity, when the unity does not come, when someone else says, right, you must agree with me tacitly, or when people refuse to allow the unity that you have empowered to become real, there's this enormous sense of suffering and pain, right, that can happen. And it's hard. But dealing with that suffering and pain, you have two choices for how you will deal with it. Either you can deal with it like buffered selves and withdraw, and therefore withdraw from your charism, or you can deal with it like porous selves and deal with it like yourselves. So this difficulty, right, this balance that needs to be maintained is not just to say that you must make yourselves vulnerable at all times. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. What it means instead is that you ought not give up the gift you have been given. And you need to balance that gift with something else that you all know, the cultivation of your own individual personalities and identities, claiming yourselves such that that self cannot be violated, while choosing at certain really important and vulnerable moments to enact the kind of porosity that allows this kind of economic action to happen, that allows dialogue, that allows my friend sitting with these two rabbis to say, what are we even talking about? That never even occurred to me. You know, amazing. What this means really for the church is that you have the option of either discarding the gift that you have been given and harming or allowing a loss to emerge within the broader Catholic tradition, or engaging in ressourcement, right? Just like the French theologians would say, go back, figure out what was going on, purify it. This is what Chiara, I think, meant. You have resources for this. One of them is what Chiara meant in her famous essay on the Between Two Fires, right? These things are there only when both are present. Or it's what Father Moran has been saying to you over the last number of years. That you must not no one must take over the dynamic of unity. It's a false practice of Jesus forsaken. This ongoing act, this is, in other words, the ongoing act of discovering what your tradition actually is. And what it means is that even though you go back to the sources, it is not in the origin point that it was most pure. Instead, it is now that it is purer than it was then. That is literally what the quote from Dei Verbum meant. The ongoing experience over many years of the unfolding of the original gift. This is what John Henry Newman meant in the mid-19th century when he talked about the actual gift of revelation is not unfolded fully in its initial moment, but only when it flows down the mountain of revelation and is purified by running over the rocks on the mountain. Yours are the mountains of the Dolomites. But the purification of the charism is happening now, not then. So what does this mean, right? What does this mean? It means that you have a gift, as the Society of Jesus did, that you must offer to the church. For us, for the Society, ours was the gift of individualism within the body of the church. We are still the mystical body of the church. We are not individuals who voluntarily choose to join a community and thereby become saved. No, the church's tradition holds, but nevertheless we are individuals. For you, you offer the gift of showing how these individuals can again be reunited. This is the gift, I think, in fact, of all of the movements, but perhaps in a particular way for you all who seek unity as a characteristic gift. The path, then, involves not a questioning, the path forward for you all involves not a questioning or a doubting of your own gifts or the viability of your own charism, but a reaffirmation of it. A commitment to it, to pursue the gift that has been given not for yourselves, but for the church and for the world. We are the ones who stand in need of it. I stand before you as a Jesuit. What is my fragility? Too individualistic. What do I need? Unity. I cannot receive it if you back away from it. No human institution is immune from the fragilities that are characteristic of humanity. That's what original sin means. All of our efforts to deny that it's real are falsified by the morning news. It's there for us. We cannot pretend, you cannot pretend, that any institution that we would build could possibly be immune from these kinds of fragilities. They will always remain there. Instead of doubting that you have a gift because the fragility is there, you must know what it is. The great Jesuit spiritual director of mine put it this way, to me, in my own prayer. He said, Patrick, you have to love your weakness. So do you. You must fall in love with the characteristic fragility that is embedded within your charism, so as to allow God, who has given you as a movement to the world, to give the gift that he wants to give through you to others. Thank you for your efforts thus far and for listening to me as I have shared with you some of these words.